Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, He is the one who created death and life in order to test which of you is best in deeds, and He is the Almighty, all-forgiving. The next narration from the book 40 Hadiths by Imam Kumayl, may Allah have mercy on his soul, is the one where you arrive at the narration which discusses the trials and the tribulations that a person might face in their everyday life. Now, trials and tribulations and tests are something which we as Shi'as in particular are very well accustomed to, and it's something which we are used to. In fact, all of the prophets and our imams and their family had endured some of the most difficult trials and tribulations that are possible for humans to endure. And as such, when they went through all of these tests, when they went through all of these trials and all of their difficulties, they left behind gems of wisdoms for us to follow on. They left recommendations and examples that we should follow when we encounter or when we have to deal with these trials and tribulations. And they give us practical steps on how to overcome them when they occur in our lives. The hadith that is discussed and explained is as follows, and it's from Shaykh al-Quraini when he narrates from Abu Abdullah alayhi salam that he said, it is mentioned in the book of Ali that all of mankind and of all the prophets, they undergo the severest of trials, and after them the awsiya, and after them the elect to the extent of their ability. Indeed, the believer undergoes trials in proportion to his good deeds. So the one whose faith is sound and whose deeds are good, his trials also become more severe. And that is because Allah did not make this world a place for rewarding the believer and for punishing the unbeliever. And the person and the one whose faith is weak and whose good deeds are few faces less trials and tribulations than the one who is of high faith. Verily, trials and tribulations hasten a person, or hasten towards the believer with greater speed than rainwater towards the earth's depths. Basically, what the Imam says when he gives us this narration is that a person who is strong in faith, a person who clings on to Islam and who holds on to it in their everyday lives, and who tries his best to do good deeds and to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is faced with more numerous difficulties and trials than a person who is not a believer. Now, initially this sounds unfair towards people who put their entire trust and faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and who believe in Him. However, there is a reason for this challenge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put forward for the believers, and this will be explained a little bit in detail. Now, we have a narration or a hadith to start off with which explains this narration we just mentioned, and it is from Amir al-Mu'mineen Imam Ali alayhi salam, where he says, we shall indeed be mixed and intermingled and then separated in the sieve of divine trial and tribulation. And there are similar other hadith which talk about this matter. And the other Imams have narrated similar things, such as Imam Sadiq. And what does it mean? It lets us know that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the prophets and sent down the messengers and the revelation of the heavenly scriptures which we have been provided, this is all for the sake of separation of humanity. The separation from the wretched evil people, between the good and righteous people, from the obedient people and from the sinful people. The person, therefore, who attains goodness in their life and hastens toward doing good deeds and striving in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does so through the grace and guidance of Allah. This is pretty clear to understand. And God has bestowed all the means of attaining all this goodness for that person to latch on to. On the other hand, for example, the person who earns evil in this life, the person who is committed to committing bad deeds and bad sins, he falls into destruction by following shaitan. He falls into destruction by following his own inner carnal desires. And his wretchedness and his damnation are earned by him out of his own free will. Each person has the choice whether they want to follow a righteous path or whether they want to follow a path which leads them to eternal damnation by doing harm. And a person does all this despite the availability of all the means and guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put forward. we have numerous ways that we can attain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yet many of us choose to divert from this path, unfortunately. The conclusive proof that, or the conclusive proof of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is established against this kind of person, and there is no excuse for someone to deviate from this path when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us all the means to reaching Him and to pleasing Him. And therefore the Quran has a verse which is revealed specifically about this, and where it says, "For it, the soul, is what it has earned, and against it is what it has merited." Now some people ask, why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us trials? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us difficulties in our everyday lives? And this is an important point. And it is crucial that we as Muslims understand the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts difficulties into our lives. Now, whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whenever God has a greater consideration and He has a love for someone, and when that person is the object of Allah's mercy and His sacred essence, to a greater extent, Allah does the following. Allah restrains him from this world and its charms with waves of calamity and tribulation. What does this mean? The person whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves is the one who is faced with more tribulations as sent by God Himself. He does this, why? So that that person's soul turns away in disgust from the world and all of the negative elements within it, and he turns his face and his heart towards the world of the hereafter. This is where we get into an important point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends these difficulties for a person to give him the chance to turn his face away from going towards the sin and from looking to the greater benefit, which is the akhirah, which is the afterlife. And by testing us with these difficulties, what we can understand and what we can see is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He sends down these difficulties, when He sends down these trials for us, He's actually looking out for us. He's not doing it as a way of punishing us. Rather, He has given us the option to prove ourselves. He has given us the option to choose whether we go into that path of eternal paradise which He promises to us. And in fact, you can see the evidence of this in reality. We often see that the best people that we know, the people with the purest hearts, and the people who go out of their way to try and be the best human beings possible on this earth, are often the ones who are faced with the most difficult afflictions. They are faced either with poverty, they are faced either with illness, and in reality this is a test for them which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set down because He loves them. Because He wants to see them do well in the real world. And when we say the real world, we don't mean this one, we mean the life which comes after. And Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam comments on this. He says, Allah treats the believer with tribulations in the same way as a man treats his family with gifts after an absence. And He restrains him from the world in the same way as the doctors prescribe restraints for a sick person. Of course, the end goal is something positive, and hence, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down difficulties for us, the end goal is something positive. Now, when we look at the severity of the trials and the tribulations which are faced by the prophets and which are faced by the key lesson which we can share from all of them is that they were made to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on account of these adversities. Whenever they were faced with them, the one thing that they would do would be to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and see the solution in order to getting close to Him. And this made them accustomed to remembering Him. They became used to it, became their habitat to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it would keep their thoughts busy with Him and keep their thoughts busy with attempting to please Him. And it is natural for human beings to seek and learn upon what they think is a support in source of times of adversity. For example, you've all heard stories of whenever there are people on a plane and the plane starts encountering turbulence and it starts to become bumpy, even people who do not believe in God will then call out, "Oh my God." They seek something which is higher above them to seek shelter in, which of course mentions and indicates the fitrah which is in a person, but it also shows that in times of difficulty we inevitably look towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And since these eminent figures, such as the holy people that we can trace back to in history, since they know no other source of support other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they turn their attention towards Him and they put all of their sole reliance in Him. And Imam al-Sadiq is reported to have said in Surah al-Kafi that the greatness of a man's reward goes with the greatness of his suffering. And Allah did not love a people, but that He subjected them to suffering. So, we have conclusive evidence from the Imam, from the Holy Quran as well, in numerous verses, that a person who endures these trials and tribulations in great numbers are the ones who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves and wants to see do well. Just briefly, one of the comments which I read from Allama al-Majlisi, which was interesting regarding the suffering of the prophets, I thought was relevant. And he says these traditions which relate to all of the difficulties which the prophets faced, which have been narrated through both the Shia and from the Sunni books, both indicate clearly that the prophets and the awliya differ from other people in respects of ailments such as illnesses and other bodily afflictions. Rather, the prophets and the awliya have a greater right than other people to suffer on account of their great reward, which is responsible for the loftiness of their stations. And this suffering is not only contrary to their station, but it causes the confirmation of their affair. Now we need to let it be known that in this world that we live in, on this planet, on this earth, in this life, due to its defective, weak nature, it is neither the abode of the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is not the place where you will get a true reward from God, neither is it the place where you will receive a true punishment from Allah. As different philosophers have said, pleasure in this world lies in simply avoiding pain. This isn't a true reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you could even say that the pleasures of this world will inevitably cause you pain. And every pleasure which you have in this world gets followed by pain and hardship. So the very material of this world that we live in lacks the capacity to accept pure, absolute punishment. There is no true punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this life, in this world that we are currently in. Now the reason that the believer is afflicted with different difficulties and trials in this life is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it neither the place of reward, neither the place of chastisement. It is not the place where a believer will attain his true reward and the true end goal for a believer, and it is not the place where a kafir, for example, will experience the true punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This comes after these difficulties and trials have been met and how these people have dealt with them. And the Holy Quran talks about this. It says, "Let not the unbelievers suppose that the respite we grant them is better for them. We grant them respite in this world only that they may increase in sin, and there awaits a humiliating chastisement and punishment for them afterwards." In finishing off this topic, the Quran states, "Verily, we created man from a drop of sperm so that we may test him, and therefore we made him hearing and seeing. We have indeed showed him the way, now he be grateful or ungrateful." There is a choice. In this world, after all the blessings which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you, you can choose to be of the ones who is grateful and who seeks to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of recognition of His awe, of His mighty. Or there are the people who are ungrateful and they take this life for granted and they do not pay attention to what comes after. They do not have any care in the world for attaining the eternal paradise which Allah promises. There are countless different miseries in this world, as you all know. There are accidents which happen, there are floods which are happening, there are storms, there is pandemics such as COVID-19, there are wars, there are riots. All of these different things, they have effects upon our lives, they have effects upon us personally, on how we go about our day-to-day life. But we are being tested when these things come to us. Whenever there is a war which afflicts our family members abroad, or whenever there is an illness which takes hold of our family members here, we are being tested on how we react to them. Do we keep our faith intact? Do we remain unshaken by these? Do we put our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do good to try and overcome them? have we proved to ourselves as a pillar of courage whenever these situations come? Do we try and sustain the hopes of other people around us to try and lift them up as well? And do we show patience when these disasters and when these tribulations befall us? Or do we fall into despair? Do we fall into misery? And do we forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now, Allah could have made us all like angels. He could have made us without any independence, without any will or without any power of our own, but this is not the case. In that case, the virtues and the deeds of a man wouldn't have been worth any praise because it would have all been determined in advance. It was and it is the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us power to do as we like and to shape our own future. Because only then is a person responsible for all of his deeds, either good deeds or evil deeds. And it should be mentioned that sometimes suffering and disaster which befall a person is not used as a test, but as a warning to people who sin or to people who go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the examples of these warnings is found in a narration from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, such as the following, where he says, when Allah is displeased, when Allah is unhappy with a people, and yet He doesn't want to wipe them out completely, then the prices of things go up, people's lifespans become shortened, the trade and the business becomes unprofitable, and the land bears less fruits and crops. Now you can see this when you see the British economy tumbling, when you can see the shortage of food in the supermarket. This is something which has been narrated from the Holy Prophet, where he says, when a people have gone so far in disobedience, he sends a warning to them in this form. Rasulullah also explained that, for example, adultery, when it is practiced openly in society, such as in this society, this increases the accidental and sudden deaths of people. And it brings about plagues and diseases and illnesses which had never been heard of before. And as you see, the societies who engage in these acts are the ones who are always most heavily afflicted with these illnesses and these diseases. When people resort to cheating in weight and measure, when they're doing business and they missell and they do fraud, which is especially common, unfortunately now even amongst Muslim communities, the Holy Prophet says, when this comes, then you will find famine, you will find unemployment, and you will find tyrants. And this is something which is pretty clear to see in this country today. And lastly, he says, when rich people withhold their zakat, then poverty strikes the community. And Amir al-Mu'mineen said in this regard, if everyone who is able to pay their zakat did so, then there would not be a needy person in society. However, you'll see that the majority of people, unfortunately, do not pay the dues which they are supposed to, and therefore poverty remains. And these are just a few examples of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives warnings so that we may change and fix our ways. He doesn't put these tests and difficulties upon us so that we can just sit in them and feel despair and not attempt to change our ways. Indeed, He says Allah does not change the way of a people unless they change it themselves. However, we should also remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His mercy has hidden the true purpose of a particular suffering from our eyes. And therefore, if a person is suffering from poverty, and they're suffering from illness as well, and they're suffering from a lot of other calamities, we shouldn't assume that that person is a sinner, for example, who's undergoing a punishment. Why? Because that person might be a good person. He might have done so many good deeds which have been done in secret, for example, and he is undergoing a hard test for his virtues. We shouldn't judge people based on what we see with our eyes and based on what is apparent. We should instead concentrate upon our own spiritual and moral upliftment in order to try and please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order to realize that these difficulties which we may be faced with may be a sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves us and wants to see us do well for ourselves. It might be that a horrible tragedy which befalls you in this life is merely a test to see how you will react to it and to see how your future will be determined. And to finish, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant victory to the mu'mineen and the mujahideen and the madlumeen, and for all of the shuhada, especially in Palestine and Gaza, and for the Hajj al-Sha'bi. Please recite Surah Al-Fatiha after salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.